You are attending the southern-ish, kind of the southeast-ish regional nutrition director meeting. We usually have these every year in person, and as you know, that's not possible this year. So we are holding them virtually. I wanted to just start off by reminding you that just like the meetings that we have in other years, this is your meeting to discuss with others. So we really want to make sure that you feel comfortable doing that. We can utilize the chat feature to do some of that discussion, but you're also more than welcome to unmute your lines. And if you're on the phone, you can press *6 to mute and unmute to weigh in as we have discussions. Just a reminder that if you're not speaking, to make sure that you're muted either through Zoom or on your phone. And we have two main agenda items today. The first hour or so, we welcome Jim Colonic from the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. And he's going to talk to us about food safety, recap some of the visits that he and I conducted last year in 2019 to remind folks of some of the observations that we had. And then also spend some time talking about food safety in this new pandemic era and beyond. And then in the second hour or so, we'll move into a discussion about the nutrition program, particularly possible reopening of congregate dining centers, and have some discussions on how that is going, if you're already open, what you've learned, and then talk about how the future might look from our perspective and what you're seeing out there in your communities. So that's the general agenda for today. We'll get started right away because that's a lot to cover in just 2 hours. And just know that we may have future meetings to discuss some of these similar issues. So today will not be the only opportunity, but we do want to have as much participation as possible. So I did not mention, but for anyone who might not know, I'm Sarah Koenig, the Elder Nutrition Program Manager in the State Office on Aging. And I'm joined today by our area agencies on aging from Guar, Jean Lynch, and Pam Van Kampen, and soon to be Lori Fernandez. And then from Dane, Angela Velasquez and Elise Miller, and from Milwaukee, Galen Reske. So welcoming all of them. So we'll get started with Jim. Jim, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen. Great.
All right, everybody can see that?
Yes.
Okay, I put my microphone a little bit closer, so hopefully everyone can hear me a little bit better. Thanks for having me here today. This is actually better than just sitting and staring at my computer all day. So I'm glad that I get the opportunity to come and mingle with you guys. Again, my name is Jim Colonic. I'm the Chief for Retail, Food, and Recreational Programs with the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I've been with food safety and recreational licensing program with DHS and now over at DADCAP for over 21 years. Before that, I was with the City of Madison Public Health Department for 6 years before most people say I moved over to the dark side. What I wanted to talk about today was just go over what we're going to talk about today. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about what Sarah and I did last year when we came and visited many of you throughout the state. To try to discuss how DADCAP and Department of Aging will be able to move forward in how we look at inspections or licensing in the future, and then just share some of the observations that we made, and then talk a little bit about food safety recommendations in a post-COVID 19 environment. Everyone knows now what COVID looks like, um, more than we probably want to know what it looks like. But it's here, it's now, and it's probably going to be part of our future. And how we do things will probably forever be changed as we move forward. So Sarah and I met last year to talk about food safety and licensing considerations for Wisconsin meal service sites. And technically in statute, senior meal sites are serving meals to the public. They are not technically exempt from licensing, but this isn't something in the past that was ever really dealt with. And so Sarah and I have probably been meeting for a couple of years, trying to figure out how do we move forward from where we are now. And before we could really start to have that discussion, we said, you know what, let's just go out and look at what's out there in Wisconsin. So through August, October last year, we made over 21 different on-site visits to individual meal sites throughout Wisconsin. And these weren't inspections, but they were really just, we just wanted to see what was out there. What were the different types of food operations that were occurring, and how were they preparing those meals? And you know, part of the objective was to let's take a look at the food safety practices. What type of equipment were people using? Was it residential equipment? Was it commercial equipment? And then what type of food preparation was occurring? Were they getting deliveries? Were they doing on-site? How many meals were being delivered? Um, and what we found was it's all over the place. Throughout the state, every one of these objectives that we looked at, I don't know that one place is the same as the next. Everybody does things a little bit differently. Some places are more set up to have commercial equipment. Some places are dealing with residential equipment. Some places are doing on-site meal preparation. Others are having meals delivered through a caterer or a restaurant or some other type of entity. And so part of this now is for Sarah and I to get back together, probably sometime after the COVID situation passes us, to start trying to look at the different models of what we have out there and start talking about how do we move forward as far as having some type of inspectional consideration or licensing for senior food service operations. One of the things that I was really impressed about from the start was just the food safety knowledge of all the individual sites that we stopped at. People were very informed and very knowledgeable when it came to food safety. And I was really impressed about the dedication that the staff showed. These people are treated like they treat their own family members. And I really took that to heart and found that very encouraging, the dedication that you folks have to the people that you serve. They're really invested in the community and the service that they provide. One of the things that was an observation was that from a food safety perspective, the food was normally transported, received, and served in less than 4 hours. And from a food safety perspective, if we can do things in less than 4 hours, we really lower the risk a foodborne illness occurring as 4 hours to reproduce into numbers that are going to cause somebody to get sick. So one of the things we talked about was that equipment and the type of food service vary greatly across the state. On-site meals versus the number of food deliveries. Um, Sometimes we found that one of the, at least in the sites that we visited, that many times the delivery exceeded the number of people that are actually served on site. It's kind of a mixed bag when we look at the types of equipment. It's pretty much mixed throughout the state. They might have a commercial dish machine, but a residential cooler, or they have a commercial refrigerator, but a residential dish machine. It's a little varied throughout the state. And the food preparation varies as well. Again, as we talked about, from people that completely do all the food preparation on site to those that are simply just service because the food is brought to them and they basically keep it hot or keep it cold, plate it up and serve it. And then warewashing and food preparation equipment varied as well, anywhere from 2-compartment sinks to 4-compartment sinks to home style and commercial dish machines. So what I did is I tried to put some things into, not an expert when it comes to Excel, but I was able to do a little bit with graphing, and you can kind of see from what we looked at here some of the things that we observed and looked at. Out of the 21 different locations that we stopped at, you could see that 4 had commercial dish machine and refrigeration. 3 had commercial stoves. 1 had a dedicated food preparation sink. 5 of the sites had steam tables. 9 had a dedicated hand washing sink and hand washing supplies. 12, we were able to verify certified food managers. 14, we were able to verify that temperatures were taken and recorded every day. And 9 of those we were able to verify that delivery temperatures were taken and recorded every day. And that's not to say that temperatures weren't taken every day or delivery temperatures weren't taken, but we were only able to verify that they were documented that many times. But we did see that a lot of people were taking temperatures that just didn't necessarily get recorded. Then we kind of focused on those facilities where they actually did some type of food preparation on site and kind of looked at those numbers. Out of the 21 sites that we visited, 13 of the sites were doing some type of food preparation. And that ranged from full service to maybe just preparation of a side or something like that. And you can see here that the differences between home style and commercial dish machines, refrigeration, stoves, food preparation, food safety training, and dedicated hand washing. So you can see that there are some areas that we do really well in and some areas that may need to have some type of improvement. But at this point, this was just what we observed in those locations. And then as we went through, like I said, we didn't perform an inspection. We just casually made observations. If it was something that was kind of like staring us right in the face, we just kind of made a note of it for future discussion. And what I wanted to share with you is just some of the observations that we found as we went around to the different sites. One of the things that we observed was in some instances, we had a lack of separation between hand washing and food preparation. So the same sink that we were doing food preparation in was the same sink where hand washing was also occurring. From a food safety perspective, we really like to keep those operations separate. Many times there were hand washing sinks available, but soap and single-use toweling was not readily available to use with that. Uh, we observed home style dish machines that some did not have a sanitizing cycle, and some were NSF approved. And those that had a sanitizing cycle, sometimes the person was not able to determine if it was working correctly or not because they did not have the appropriate testing materials, either for a chemical dish machine or a hot water dish machine. And so those are one of the things that I talked about with Sarah, making sure that if they're going to use a dish machine for sanitation, that we get appropriate material. One of the areas that we a lot of was freezing of leftovers. And this is a challenging issue to deal with because I understand don't want to throw out food. They want to be able to save that and use that at a later time. But the issue that we have really with freezing is making sure that we're meeting proper cooling methods and cooling food following the parameters in the food code, which is whenever that food gets to a temperature of 135 degrees, we have 2 hours to get that food down to 70, and then you have an additional 4 hours to go from 70 down to 41. Now, the biggest problem with that is that none of you were there during this cooling process. And so many times once you're done serving and cleaning up, you're out of there. And that there's nobody that's actually there that can monitor to make sure that that food reached proper temperature and was cooled properly. And this is the same issue and the same conversation that I have with DPI and all the school kitchens. When these food service operators are done with their meal service, they're pretty much cleaning up and they're gone. And so we had to have the discussion with them that if you don't have the opportunity or the method of verifying that the product is cooling properly, then you simply shouldn't cool. You should simply discard. If in doubt, throw it out. If you can't adequately determine if the food is meeting proper cooling parameters, then it's more of a risk to save it than it is to discard it. We did witness a few instances where food was being received from either a caterer or a restaurant at improper temperature. Bricks or hot packs that were provided weren't hot or cold. The hot packs were warm to the touch. So some communication there with the caterer or the delivery service. We also found some shipping containers which were received from a catering location which were visibly soiled, meaning that they probably weren't being cleaned and sanitized on a regular basis. Some observations that we saw with the delivery was that some routes exceeded an hour plus, which is difficult. It's a long time for that food to remain at proper temperature in those hot boxes. And you struggle with finding adequate volunteers or somebody that can't show up that day, and it extends the routes, and just looking at some alternatives for how we can get routes down to less than an hour for delivery. We talked about some home style equipment issues that we found. Separate food prep sinks for those sites where they're actually doing all of the food preparation on site. They should have a dedicated sink that's solely just for thawing or slicing, dicing, chopping, washing vegetables. We talked about the lack of the sanitizer test strips. We mentioned that the temperature monitoring is not always recorded daily, but I think just about every place we were at, they had thermometers. They were using thermometers, just weren't documenting them every day. It's a habit that uh, people need to be trained in doing that. And I always encourage people to, put your temperature list on the refrigerator with a magnet or something so that it's staring at you every day as a reminder that you have to document those temperatures. We did see bare hand contact with ready-to-eat foods. It's not a glove rule. It just means that if you're going to handle ready-to-eat foods, single-use gloves are one option. You can use tongs or utensils or deli tissues, but once that food is in a ready-to-eat form, we should not be contacting it with our bare hands. Um, and the other thing we talked about was the good news from a public health control consideration is that uh, foods that are improperly held at proper temperature for under 4 hours, the risk is greatly reduced. And if there are instances where you do not have the ability to hold food at proper temperature and you have a plan that you put together called a time as a public health control plan that basically gives you that 4 hour window where at the end all the food is discarded. Um, it's safe, doesn't necessarily mean it's palatable. Um, when people have soup, they want their soup hot. They don't want it lukewarm. Um, from my perspective, it still may be safe, but it may not be something that I want to eat. But there are different types of food items where using time as a public health control certainly could be used and done safely. So the fun part, food safety post COVID-19. And so we all kind of struggle with this because what we have right now in Wisconsin, since the Supreme Court overturned the governor's orders, is we basically have every county out there that has the ability to kind of set their own rules and orders in place with respect to COVID-19. And you have some counties that are absolutely not doing anything. You have some counties that people may look at and say, wow, they're going really above the board of what others are doing. And then you have some that are kind of following the general guidelines that the state have put out. And so we're kind of all over the place, and we're not in a position as an agency to issue any rules when it comes to COVID-19, but offer guidance. And so what you are going to see in these next few slides are what we at the Department of Agriculture, Trade and Consumer Protection have basically put together as best practices moving forward. And I would say before you implement anything or decide to open or whatever your plans are for your sites, that you check with your local health department because they're actually the authority through this. And you may have a local health department that has stricter orders in place that pertain to your particular operation. So just some of the things that we make, that we indicate as far as best practices are, of course, stay home when you're sick. The food code already talks about, vomiting and diarrhea and a fever with a sore throat and jaundice. But what we're talking about during the pandemic are COVID-19 related symptoms, which a lot of these can sometimes be masked as foodborne illness or flu type symptoms. But we're looking really for people that are coughing, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, chills, a fever higher than 100.4, sore throat, loss of taste or smell. Some of the things that you all are probably familiar um, with information that has been coming out since March. if you are going to operate and if you are going to use face coverings, make sure you have an adequate supply of face coverings, that you use single-use paper toweling and utensils if possible, and of course, use single-use gloves. I encourage you to have hand sanitizer on hand as well, so that not only your staff can use the hand sanitizer, but also encourage the customers that come in and the seniors that come in to also use that hand sanitizer as well. Really want to have a general conversation with staff about trying not to share work tools and equipment. This is desk phones, cell phones, computers, pens, pencils, calculators, uh, that if you're going to have multi-use equipment that is shared by multiple people, that those are being sanitized on a regular basis. Um, but it's all very easy for us to share pens and multitask when using a cell phone. But we just need to be more cognizant about that, especially during COVID-19. Other areas that customers come into contact with a lot, such as doors, doorknobs, buttons, those should be sanitized frequently as well. Also encourage, if you are going to be opening your meal sites, that you get together with your staff and make sure that they understand all of the policies and procedures that you're going to put in place so that everyone is on the same page. Consider being able to create some alternating work teams, so that if something happens where a staff person becomes ill, there is another person that can step into that role, and it doesn't interfere with your operations, and you still continue to do the good work that you do. Sometimes it's a little difficult where maybe you only have 3 people and that's all you have is 3 people. You know, you have to do the best that you can. But if you have an opportunity to have some backup plans, it's advisable to do that if you can. If you're going to use disinfectant wipes, you want to make sure that you're trying to make sure that those are being discarded when they're visibly soiled. A good rule of thumb is, you know, use 1 wipe per table. But if I had tables that that were not heavily soiled, I would maybe do more than 1. But a good rule of thumb is, if it's visibly soiled, it really needs to be discarded. We talked about providing hand sanitizer. You want to make sure that it's at least 60% alcohol. I would encourage you to put that at the entrance, so that anybody entering the facility maybe have some signage up there encouraging people that are entering the building to use the hand sanitizer. And I think everybody's kind of used to doing that now. As you go to different locations, you go to grocery stores and restaurants, Home Depot, any place you go, everyone has got the hand sanitizer out now. But I think people are getting used to that's something that they expect when they go into a facility. If you're going to have your restrooms available, you might want to have up some signage that indicates please 1 patron at a time, and then making sure that you're cleaning and sanitizing the restroom on a regular, frequent basis as well. We talked about using those single use disposable gloves, not only when doing food service, but also when you're doing any cleaning or disinfection duties. Instructing staff that if you're going to require them to wear face coverings, that they understand how to wear those face coverings appropriately, in how to handle those face coverings, which means you want to try to avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth so that you're not contaminating that face covering yourself. As always, make sure staff are washing their hands often with soap and water for at least 20 seconds. We talked about putting some signage on the front door, letting customers know about what changes there are to your policies, and instructing them to stay away if they're experiencing any COVID-like symptoms. We talked about the hand sanitizing, um, making sure that we eliminate any unnecessary physical contact between staff and customers, trying to maintain that social distancing of at least 6 feet as much as possible, not only between staff, but between staff and customers and between the customers themselves. If at all possible, try to go to single-use items or disposable items, such as knives, forks, spoons, condiments. Try not to put bottles of ketchup or salt and pepper shakers out on tables for patrons to use. Try to use disposable, single-use salt, sugar, pepper packages, and same with condiments like ketchup and mustard. Then you have less of a um, chance of multiple people touching those objects. I've also seen where somebody wanted ketchup, they have those little disposable cups, and one of the food service staff could actually put some ketchup in a little disposable paper cup for individuals as well. So there are many ways to get around it, but trying to minimize that multi-touch surface as much as possible. When it comes to using a sanitizer, it's just important to make sure that it's an EPA registered disinfectant for food surfaces. Or you can also use a bleach solution. And I put some directions here if somebody wanted to use a bleach solution. An unscented bleach is what is going to have an EPA registration on it. If it has any type of scent to it, it's not going to have an EPA registration, and you really shouldn't use that. But if you're using an unscented bleach like Clorox, simply a third cup to a gallon of water for non-food contact surfaces, 1 teaspoon per gallon of water for food contact surfaces, and just make sure that we're not mixing different chemicals together, especially bleach and ammonia. That could be a little hazardous. It's a good idea to have a conversation with staff prior to their shift, just to see how they're feeling or if they're experiencing any symptoms. So if they are, you can direct those employees to immediately go home. We talked about removing the condiments from the table and make sure that those are single use or prepackaged or dispensed by employees. We want to make sure that we don't have any food buffets or self-service areas open. The safest way would be to have service staff simply plate those meals and then bring those out to folks. And then it's also a good idea to clean and sanitize tables and chairs after each use, and to try to rearrange tables so that the tables are at least 6 feet apart, and try to maintain some type of separation between the patrons as well at those tables. Some folks have a much larger space that they can effectively do this with. Other folks have smaller spaces. It's going to be kind of challenging. You really have to kind of make that determination if it's really appropriate to open up the dining facility, or if it should really just kind of be left to pick up or delivery. And that's a discussion that you need to have with with your center and your local health department as to the best way to move forward. If you're going to have some opportunity for people to socialize, we certainly don't want to discourage that, but we just want to try to make sure that we try to maintain that 6 feet of social distancing as much as possible. Try not to preset silverware on tables. Um, what we've encouraged people to do is to actually roll up those single-use utensils in a napkin that you can hand to them with their meal, so that we don't have utensils that are sitting out in the open. I did post some resources that you can also use. A lot of these are geared to like restaurants and grocery stores and different things like that, but that doesn't mean that they can't apply in your folks' situation. You just might have to adapt them a little bit, but there's some pretty good guidance that OSHA puts out, CDC puts out. The Restaurant Association has got some good guidance, the Tavern League, and also, on FDA's website, they actually have some really good recommendations for food service in general. But the bottom line that I usually talk to with most people is to, one, make sure you keep yourself and your staff safe, as well as the people that you're serving. And a lot of these problems are going to be overcome by just following good food safety practices as outlined in the Wisconsin Food Code. But I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has. I think Sarah or Jean, if you've got anybody that has put something in the chat box, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions, or if anybody wants to just ask a question, I'd be happy to respond.
Sure.
Oh, I know one thing you wanted me to talk about was the certified food managers.
Yes.
So a lot of you have your certified food manager certification, and it may be coming or have expired during the COVID epidemic. And people weren't able to renew their certification because classes weren't being offered. And so we granted an extension to our operators for 90 days. And now we're just extending that again until October 1st. But in the meantime, over, I think, the last week in June, two weeks ago, I was actually notified that some courses are beginning to open back up and hold classes, and that there's online courses and exams that can be taken. I believe 360 Training is one that will actually hold the course online, and you can actually take the exam online too. And so those are options for people, but there are classes now that are starting to open up, but online is always available.
And Jim, most of our programs, it seems, utilize ServSafe from the National Restaurant Association. Is their online exam acceptable for folks to take? Or does it need to be proctored in person?
I don't know. I'm not sure what ServSafe is doing at this point, if they're
Okay.
doing proctoring. But that would be something you could probably check with them. But you might have the Restaurant Association, which I know does ServSafe. You may just want to check with some of the providers to see if they have plans to start holding any classes. And of course, DATCAP has a complete list of all the approved courses in Wisconsin that you can take. And it might just take a couple of phone calls to figure out who and when they are going to offer courses in your area.
Okay, thank you. We don't have questions coming in so far. Donna, we'll address your question about reopening in a little bit here. And Pam and others, I will be sharing that Jim's PowerPoint via email with everyone on the meeting appointment, so you'll see something soon. Okay, Jenny in Door County is saying that she has a staff member signed up for a class in Green Bay on July 20th with the Tavern League. So that's an in-person class, Jenny? Yes, thank you. Okay, so they are starting to have some in-person classes, it looks like. Does anyone have any questions for Jim about his presentation? This could also be a good time to ask questions or potentially share information. Jim works quite extensively with the local public health departments, as you know, we do to a little bit of a lesser extent, but Jim does. So, okay, we have a question from Davin in Kenosha. Once we open, if a diner comes to a site and then later tests positive for COVID, what is the recommendation? Do we need to close the site, notify diners? I imagine we cannot disclose personal information.
Correct. My advice would be that the first thing you do is you contact your local health department, and then you're going to work with the local health department, because there's probably going to be some contact tracing that needs to be done. And then you're really going to follow CDC's guidelines for workers that have experienced exposure to COVID-19. And so you're really going to look at any of your staff that are experiencing symptoms. But I'd really work closely with the local health department, because they're going to be the best ones to evaluate what you should do at that point.
This has happened in a couple states in our region that I've heard about on recent calls, and in those cases they have had to close, but it is important to check with your local public health department, like Jim said, so that because they'll have an extent to how much contact there was and what level of spread there might have been. Good question. And we have had a couple programs across the state who have had volunteers or staff members who have tested positive. So this happens. So it's very important to have those relationships and that contact with public health to determine what to do next.
I should to mention to you, Sarah, that you probably know that we've been working on a new version of the food code. And so I've heard that that has passed the legislature. And so that should be posted in the register, hopefully within the next month. And then in 90 days, we'll have a new Wisconsin food code that will be based on the 2013 version of the FDA code. So there will be some significant food safety changes in there. And then we'll probably immediately open it up and bring it up to date with the 2017 and 2019 changes, so that we'll get caught right back up to where we should be with the food code.
Okay, that's good to know. So we'll be having some training this fall probably for our site managers and staff and volunteers to share. Any other questions for Jim?
Okay, Sarah, may I ask a question? I have a question, Jim, about, and I don't know if you can answer this, but do you recommend for older adults and possibly meal site managers, volunteers, either the fabric masks or the paper masks?
I don't think it really matters. I mean, there is not one, the cloth mask or the disposable mask, they're a preventative. None of those are going to prevent you from getting COVID-19, but all they're going to do is lower your risk. We've experienced some of this with our own staff, that some prefer the cloth masks. We've had other people that have said the disposable masks are a little bit lighter and it seems like they're easier to breathe through the fabric than a cloth mask. But it's really a personal preference. Uh, Regarding if you're going to use a cloth face mask, I think that they just need to understand that that is something that should be washed daily, and that you shouldn't just have this mask that you have in your back pocket that you just continually use every day. That if you're going to utilize a cloth mask, it is something that should probably be needs to be washed every single day, where the disposable would just be discarded. And depending upon how long you're working, you may need more than one mask. As soon as that disposable mask or that cloth mask becomes moist or soiled, it should be changed.
Thank you.
Okay. Any further questions or comments? Feel free to unmute if you don't want to use the chat. I'm curious about some of the biggest food safety challenges that you're facing right now in getting meals out, either by carry out or through home delivered meals, or if you happen to be open, what you're seeing right now is the biggest challenges.
Sarah, this is Angela. Our biggest challenge in getting the meals out and through home delivered is the need for volunteers. We've had senior volunteers who do not feel safe coming back, even though it is somewhat of a contactless delivery. We had a lot of volunteers early on in the disease because they were out of work and could help. And now that we're opening up, and here Dane is at phase 2, may go back to phase 1 if we're not careful here, that there's a shortage of volunteers. That is our biggest challenge right now.
Okay. What about training? There's been a lot of new volunteers coming on. How has it been to train those volunteers on safe food handling?
For the most part, they're the delivery volunteers and they get the same training that they got pre-COVID.
Sure.
With regard to food safety. But now it also involves that they sanitize before they get out of their car. They sanitize when they get back in their car. They only take one meal out at a time. They use gloves. They hang it on the door, knock, step back 6 to 8 feet just to see if someone answers the door. You know, there's a lot that has changed in making it contactless and as safe as possible, where there's not a sink to wash their hands, sanitize, sanitize, sanitize. When they get back, that they wash their hands and sanitize again, you know, so that's been kind of a one-on-one every time a new volunteer comes on, explaining the process and making sure they understand the new way of doing things. Sanitizing the handles on the bags, making sure that we're cleaning those carry bags that everybody's touching, and you know, or that we're wearing gloves as much as possible. So just a lot of that type of training that is different than pre-COVID.
Thank you for sharing that.
I did just see someone else's comment, and it's not just, yes, there's a tremendous increase in volunteers, and another reason for that increase is we have a lot more meals to be delivered. We're seeing people go from 3 routes to 5 routes in certain areas. So that also is a challenge, just the sheer volume.
Sure. And then I'm sure all the extra precautions that are being taken probably makes a route take longer. Going back to kind of what Jim was talking about with the length of routes. So yeah. Thanks. Kim Losey from Kewanee, Manitowoc was wondering if any of the other directors could share what you're using to train volunteers since COVID. So if anyone has those things that they would be willing to share, if you could pass them along to Guar or to me, and we can get those out. I'm seeing some other challenges, not necessarily food safety related, but definitely the desire for reopening from some customers. Challenges with customers social distancing. And like you were saying, Angela, the increase of new home delivered meal clients. So that's kind of a good segue. But before we move on, are there any final questions that anyone has for Jim before we let him get back to the Wisconsin Food Code or any of those other things that he's busy working on? All right. Well, thank you, Jim, so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.